Welcome back, everyone. Settle in for this one because we're about to tear apart one of the most viral, most exaggerated, and most financially dangerous narratives floating around the XRP ecosystem right now. And before anyone gets emotional, understand this. This isn't about attacking a person. This is about protecting people who actually want to build wealth instead of getting hypnotized by fantasy numbers. Because when you start hearing claims like XRP is going to $100 or $750 or even $10,000, and it's all going to happen in a matter of weeks, you have two choices: get seduced or get smart. Today we're choosing the second option, and it all starts with Jake Claver, a guy who has built an enormous amount of attention by leaning into the most extreme price predictions in the XRP world. The reason he went viral isn't hard to figure out. He speaks with absolute certainty about outcomes that sound impossible to anyone grounded in reality. When he says he's 99.9% sure XRP is going to $100 by the end of the year, he knows exactly what that does to people emotionally. That level of confidence hooks the audience instantly. It makes people feel like someone out there finally has secret information, some hidden insider whispering the truth while the rest of the market sleeps. And let's be brutally honest, those kinds of statements hit people right where it hurts, because if you're holding XRP right now, if you're frustrated by the sideways movement, if you're tired of watching other assets move while XRP stalls, hearing someone swear they have near absolute certainty about a 200x explosion within weeks taps into the oldest human weakness, wanting the miracle outcome without doing the hard thinking. It gives people a story to latch onto, a shortcut, a dream. But this is exactly why these predictions spread so fast, because they bypass logic. They don't appeal to strategy, they appeal to emotion. $100 XRP by year-end is the kind of headline that makes even experienced holders pause for a second, and that's the real danger. Certainty is seductive even when it's completely unsupported. Now here's the part most people skip. Jake doesn't just throw out these numbers casually. He attaches them to claims like, "I can't tell you everything I know," or "I have insider conversations that I can't disclose." That's the kind of language designed to make people feel like they're missing out on privileged information. But the second someone starts implying they have secret intel that justifies extreme predictions, the credibility meter should drop, not rise. Because think about it, if XRP actually were about to jump from 50 cents to $100 in a year, no one with real insider access would be broadcasting it on social media for free, and certainly not with 99.9999% certainty. That level of confidence isn't expertise, it's marketing. But here's the deeper truth. The reason these claims get traction is because people want them to be true. They run the mental math. If XRP jumps to $100, maybe that's financial freedom. If it hits $750, maybe that's generational wealth. If it hits $10,000, maybe that's a complete life reset. And that emotional hook is exactly why people stop thinking critically. So in this first part, before we even get into the newer predictions or the $10,000 claim or the public betting clips, I want you to understand the foundation. This narrative gained power because it exploited hope during a time of uncertainty. People weren't buying the prediction, they were buying the possibility that someone out there finally had the answers. Now let's move into the part where the entire narrative begins to crack. Not because of emotion, but because of inconsistency. When someone makes a bold prediction, you judge it based on two things: the reasoning behind it and the consistency over time. And this is exactly where Jake Claver's story starts to fall apart, because once you line up his older claims next to his newer ones, the picture stops looking like conviction and starts looking like improvisation. Let's go back to the original clip, the one that first sent his name spiraling across crypto Twitter. This was around December of last year, and he wasn't just bullish, he was practically claiming divine certainty. XRP from 50 cents to $100 in a little more than a year, he said. And then he emphasized the part most people conveniently ignore. He was 99.9999% sure. Not hopeful, not optimistic, nearly certain. That level of certainty is outrageous, especially when it's tied to an outcome that requires XRP to move harder and faster than any major asset in financial history. But instead of walking that prediction back, instead of saying, okay, maybe that was too aggressive, he doubled down. And that's where the credibility starts to erode, because credible analysts adjust their outlooks based on real data. They refine, they adapt, they update. What they don't do is shift from one extreme prediction to an even more extreme prediction without providing a rational pathway or updated evidence. And that's exactly what Jake does next. Fast forward to more recent weeks, November, December of this year. He's no longer talking about $100. Now suddenly the target jumps to $10,000 per XRP by the end of 2026 or early 2027. Think about how absurd that leap is. Not only does he skip over the previous target as if it never existed, but he now claims an even more explosive multiplier, and he does it with the same tone of insider confidence. If the first prediction required a miracle, this one requires rewriting global finance. A $10,000 XRP would create trillionaires overnight and push XRP's market cap beyond the GDP of most developed countries. These are not small shifts. These are not normal revisions. These are massive narrative jumps that make one thing clear. The message changes, but the style stays exactly the same. But here's where it gets even more revealing. Instead of acknowledging why the earlier prediction failed or providing context for why the new one is supposedly more realistic, he treats each new number as if he just received fresh secret intel from sources he can't mention. That's not analysis, but that's theatrics. When someone claims they have information they can't share, yet they're comfortable broadcasting world-changing predictions on social media, you're not dealing with a financial model. You're dealing with an influence narrative. This is why so many people fall for it, because he sells confidence, not logic. And confidence is intoxicating when the market feels unclear. But this is exactly why you have to step back and evaluate the pattern, not the prediction. The pattern is simple. Every time the timeline collapses and reality gets too close, the prediction gets pushed further away and inflated to an even more unbelievable number. The other problem is timing. When someone gives you a prediction that expires in weeks and then suddenly updates it with a prediction years out, they're not refining their forecast. They're buying time. And when someone's credibility depends on buying time, it should set off alarms. So at this stage of the analysis, forget whether the number is $100, $750, or $10,000. Forget the specific claims about SWIFT, stock market settlement, derivatives, or tokenization timelines. The core issue is consistency, and there is none. It's a moving target with no underlying structure. Now we get to the part people avoid because it forces them to confront numbers instead of narratives. And numbers don't care how bullish you feel. Numbers don't bend for optimism. Numbers don't reward blind loyalty. They expose the gap between fantasy and feasibility. And Jake's 10,000 XRP by end of 2026 or early 2027 prediction collapses instantly the moment you apply even the most basic economic pressure test. Start with simple market cap math, the thing every analyst should do before making explosive price claims. At $10,000 per token, XRP's market cap would exceed $1 quadrillion. Let that settle in. That's not big. That's not unprecedented. That's mathematically absurd. There isn't a single asset class on Earth, not gold, not global equities, not global real estate, not sovereign debt, that sits anywhere near that territory. For XRP to reach $10,000 in the timeline Jake proposes, you would need to reprice the entire global economy into one asset within 12 to 18 months. That's not analysis, that's science fiction. And even if we pretend the world suddenly decided to dump all other financial systems and use XRP as the primary global settlement layer, which is already unrealistic, it still wouldn't support a $10,000 valuation that fast. The infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, cross-border implementations, liquidity corridors, and institutional risk cycles don't move at meme speed. They move in multi-year, carefully balanced stages. Even Ripple itself doesn't communicate anything remotely close to such timelines, and they're the ones building the ecosystem. Now let's address the claim that SWIFT, stock market settlement, FX, commodities, and partial tokenization will all be online and fully running on XRP by Q2 2026. Again, this isn't grounded in reality. Every major financial rail transition in history has taken years of testing, slow ramping, and phased deployment, not a sudden switch flipped by a single insider's private conversations. Ripple is indeed integrating pieces of infrastructure, but there is a difference between pilot programs, early corridors, and full-scale global replacement. Jake collapses these stages into one fantasy timeline because the bigger the claim, the more attention it generates. And here's the contradiction nobody addresses. How does someone jump from predicting $100 in a few weeks down to $10,000 in a year without explaining why the shorter-term prediction failed or why the long-term one is now supposedly more reliable? You can't demand credibility for the second prediction when the first didn't come close. That's not analysis. That's narrative inflation. The goalpost keeps moving because the original timeline expires. The price target keeps growing because the new one needs to feel even more sensational. Even worse, a $10,000 XRP would instantly turn Ripple's founders and early holders into trillionaires. Not billionaires, trillionaires. You think governments, regulators, and global banks are going to casually allow that level of concentrated wealth to materialize overnight? The geopolitical consequences alone would be catastrophic. Entire currency systems would destabilize. The U.S. government would intervene immediately. These aren't just big numbers. These are numbers that break world economies. And this is where you need brutal honesty. The people who believe these predictions aren't stupid. They're desperate. They want the shortcut. They want the explosive miracle. They want the 200x event that erases every financial mistake they've ever made. Jake is selling hope wrapped in technical jargon. He speaks just confidently enough and just vaguely enough to sound connected without ever having to prove anything. The truth is simple. XRP does not need to hit $10,000 to be life-changing. It doesn't need to hit $750 to validate the technology. It doesn't need to hit $100 to justify years of development. But when someone positions these extreme numbers as nearly guaranteed outcomes, they're not helping the XRP ecosystem. They're undermining its credibility. This is why you cannot blindly follow charismatic predictions. You need math, market structure, macro context, adoption timelines, liquidity flow, and regulatory reality. Without those, you're building your expectations on air. Now let's address the part of this story that most people tiptoe around, the credibility gap. Because at this stage, it's not just about predictions, it's about the pattern behind those predictions, the contradictions inside them, and the way they influence the XRP community far beyond what most people realize. Jake Claver isn't just making forecasts, he's making public bets, throwing around numbers like $750 XRP by year-end and attaching dollar wagers to them to create a theater of conviction. On the surface, that sounds bold, putting your money where your mouth is. But when you look deeper, the bet tells you more about marketing psychology than confidence. An $18,000 bet for a theoretical $3.5 million payout isn't a manifestation of insider knowledge. It's an attention mechanism. It gives people the illusion that the predictor must truly believe the outcome if he's willing to attach money to it. But in reality, the size, structure, and timeline of the bet are irrelevant. Clout chasing disguised as courage is still clout chasing. And here's the bigger red flag, the inconsistency. One clip says $100 XRP by year end. Another says $750 by year end. Another says $10,000 by 2026 or 2027. These numbers aren't just different, they're incompatible. A credible analyst doesn't bounce between triple-digit targets and five-digit targets based on mood. When someone's predictions shift this dramatically in such short windows, it exposes the core issue. The predictions aren't coming from analysis. They're coming from the need to keep the narrative shocking enough to stay viral. And this does impact the XRP community in a real way. Because whether people want to admit it or not, narratives shape public perception. When the loudest voices in the community push numbers that have no mathematical basis, no regulatory basis, no liquidity basis, and no infrastructure basis, it starts to paint everyone holding XRP as unserious, delusional, or detached from reality. That hurts the brand. That pushes away institutional interest. That makes the XRP ecosystem look like it's built on hopium rather than fundamentals. And here's the honest truth most people won't say out loud. Extreme predictions don't bring in serious investors. They attract desperate ones. When someone promises $100 or $750 or $10,000 XRP within months, they're preying on the fear of missing out. They're selling a dream, not a roadmap. And dreams without structure become liabilities. They attract people who treat the asset like a lottery ticket instead of a technological infrastructure play. And that directly undermines the years of legitimate progress Ripple has fought for through regulations, partnerships, payments corridors, CBDC frameworks, and institutional integrations. There's also a dangerous psychological side effect here. People who believe in extreme forecasts often stop thinking critically. They stop analyzing liquidity. They stop watching macro conditions. They stop evaluating supply structures. They don't want to engage with reality because reality doesn't match the fantasy. So when the predictions fail, those same people end up angry, disillusioned, and convinced they were rugged, when the only rug was their own refusal to question impossible promises. And this is why the community needs to be careful. You can support XRP, you can be long-term bullish, you can believe in utility, regulatory clarity, tokenization, cross-border settlement, ODL frameworks. All of that is real, measurable, and evolving. But when influencers push fantasy targets, it damages the credibility of everyone who is trying to build a grounded, sustainable case for the asset. The irony is that the real bullish arguments for XRP's future don't require absurd numbers. They require adoption curves, liquidity corridors, institutional integration, and maturation of the broader financial system. You don't need to inflate targets to generate optimism. You just need to be honest about what's possible and what isn't. So here's where we strip the emotion out of the conversation and get brutally grounded. Because if you're an XRP holder and you're basing your expectations on $100, $750, or $10,000 targets, especially within the timelines Jake Claver throws around, you're setting yourself up for disappointment, confusion, and potentially catastrophic decision-making. Not because XRP is weak, not because the technology is flawed, and not because institutional adoption won't deepen, but because these predictions ignore every real-world constraint that actually governs how assets reprice. You need to understand something fundamental. Timeframes matter more than targets. Anyone can say XRP will be worth $10,000 someday, but when someone tells you it will hit that level in 12 to 18 months, they're no longer making a forecast. They're telling you a fairy tale. A move of that magnitude would require the entire global financial system to migrate onto XRP rails instantly, with every major bank, every derivatives market, and trillions of dollars in settlement volume, completely shifting within a single cycle. That's not bullishness. That's economic fantasy. And this is why these predictions are so damaging. They pull people out of strategic thinking and into lottery ticket psychology. They make investors obsess over the big moment instead of watching liquidity patterns, macro risk behavior, institutional flow, regulatory timelines, and real market structure. They teach people to wait for miracles instead of treating XRP like a real asset with real adoption curves. But here's the truth that actually matters. XRP doesn't need fantasy numbers to justify its long-term value. It doesn't need 10,000% explosions overnight. What matters is the continued regulatory clarity, the global shift toward tokenized value transfer, the expansion of institutional corridors, the integration of stablecoin rails, the ongoing work Ripple is doing with enterprise payments, and the fact that macro conditions are finally aligning with risk asset expansion going into 2026. Those are real catalysts. Those are real drivers. And those do not require delusional pricing to be meaningful. If you're holding XRP, your edge is not believing extreme predictions. Your edge is staying grounded while others chase noise. Your edge is keeping your expectations tied to reality. Your edge is understanding that narrative cycles come and go, but discipline, position sizing, and patience consistently outperform hype every single cycle. So ask yourself the real questions. Do you want to build wealth sustainably or gamble on someone else's fantasy timeline? Do you want to understand market structure or outsource your thinking to influencers who constantly move their own goalposts? Do you want to operate like an adult in the financial markets or like someone waiting for a miracle? Because if you can't survive the boring parts, you're not going to survive the explosive ones. And if you let viral predictions hijack your expectations, you're going to make the same mistakes thousands of traders make every cycle, buying tops, selling bottoms, and blaming everyone except yourself. The XRP community is strongest when it's intelligent, realistic, and strategic, not when it's clinging to predictions that would require rewriting the laws of economics. You don't need hopium, you need clarity, and clarity starts with rejecting anything that sounds too good to be true. And of course, as always, this entire discussion is for educational purposes only. This is not financial advice. I am not a licensed financial advisor. You must do your own research, think critically, evaluate your own risk tolerance, and make decisions that align with your individual financial situation. Never invest more than you can afford to lose, and never rely on a single prediction, especially extreme ones, to shape your financial future.